Weyembergh, and our distinguished panelists.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this PolyCIVIS roundtable discussion on facing polycrisis in Europe and Africa. We are really delighted to have you join us today, either in presence on this wonderful Paris Lodron campus, and virtually also via YouTube. Your attendance, both in presence and online, underscores the growing recognition of the urgent need to understand and address the challenges, the many challenges posed by polycrisis. This term, polycrisis, may be relatively new, but the reality it describes is, and I would say unfortunately, all too familiar. As you know, we live in an increasingly interconnected world where challenges like climate change, economic instability, pandemics, and geopolitical tensions intersect and amplify each other. The consequences are felt deeply, and this on our two continents, both in Europe and Africa, especially as vulnerabilities are often compounded. This roundtable discussion is part of our so-called PolyCIVIS project. This PolyCIVIS project is a so-called collaborative Jean Monnet network co-financed by Erasmus Plus program. And our PolyCIVIS project brings together not less than 21 universities. So the 17 CIVIS partners, so 11 European partner university in Europe and 6 university partner in Africa, plus 4 other African universities. So a lot of partners together to discuss and reflect on an interdisciplinary basis about polycrisis and the many, many challenges. Our goal today is to delve into the complexities of polycrisis. So we will explore the implications of polycrisis on both continents. We will hear from leading experts who will share their insights on how these interconnected challenges impact vulnerable populations, exacerbate social inequalities, and strain relations between Europe and Africa. And the idea is, of course, not to stop at diagnosis. We would like also to explore potential strategies, synergies, solutions, poly-solutions that can help us build resilience and foster a more sustainable and equitable future. I will guide our conversation this morning. So we will start with Paul to gauge your initial thoughts, your initial reflections about polycrisis. At the same time, I will introduce our 4 distinguished panelists, and we will then delve into the discussion, based, of course, on the expertise of our panelists. And we will finish with a Q&A session, so question from the audience in presence, but also from the audience online. A few householding notes for our audience, especially. We really encourage active participation from both our in-presence guests, but also the audience online. For those who join us online, please submit your questions via the Mentimeter application. We will only be able to take questions during the first half hour, so during the first 30 minutes, so until 9:30, because we need, of course, time to collect and compile your questions. For those who are present here in the room, please simply raise your hand to ask your question. And most importantly, of course, let's approach this conversation, this discussion with an open mind and a willingness to learn from each other's perspectives. So first, I would like to invite our audience and panelists to participate in this quick poll. And the question is simple. It should, yes, appear on the screen. When you think about polycrisis, what's the first word that comes to mind? So to the audience, you can submit your answer via the Mentimeter application. You see it there, so the QR code. And for the panelists, please could you write it down on the paper you receive. And so let's see what words resonate with you as we embark in this discussion. As the poll is running, and as you are taking part to it, I will take a moment to introduce you our four panelists. Each of them will bring his or her own expertise to the reflection. So first we have Professor Ahmadou Mbaye, former rector of the Université Cheikh Anta Diop de Dakar. As an economist with a deep understanding of development economics, the informal economy, and climate change adaptation in Africa, Professor Mbaye will offer crucial insights into how polycrisis impacts societies and economies, particularly, of course, in the global south. Professor Mbaye, thank you for being here with us. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Musemwa, who is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Professor Musemwa is an environmental historian whose research on water management and conflicts sheds light on the intricate relationship between environmental challenges and social stability, a key dimension, of course, of polycrisis. Thank you so much for being here with us as well. Joining us from this university, this Paris Lodron University, is Professor Gudrun Zagel, who is a legal expert specializing in international external relations and, in economic law and human rights as well. Taking a close look at the balance, of course, to be maintained. Professor Zagel's expertise is crucial in understanding the legal and ethical framework needed to navigate, of course, the complexities of polycrisis. I'm pleased also to welcome Professor Edward Bbaale, Thank you, Edward, for being here from Makerere University in Kampala. Edward Mbaye is an economist, and he replaces here Professor Barnabas Nawangwe, Vice Chancellor of Makerere University in Kampala. I myself, so I will moderate this, panel, and so I'm a professor of European law at the Université libre de Bruxelles, presently vice rector for external relations and cooperation at my university, and specialized in police cooperation and judicial cooperation in criminal matters between the member states of the European Union, but also between the states of the EU and third states. So let's see now the results of the poll. Okay, so we can see the importance of, well, one of the crises, of one of the challenge, climate change. Sorry, noise. Yeah, climate change, food insecurity. I see also floods, populism, and I suppose the yes, rule of law crisis, coup d'etat, war. So a lot of words referring to the crisis themselves. I see also humanitarian crisis, urgency. I see also, well, some, I would say, potential solutions to polycrisis, plurality, interdisciplinarity, leadership as well. So this is all very interesting. Right. Okay. I hope it will be better like this. So thank you, the audience, both in presence and online, for this. Now, turning myself to our panelists. Yeah. Is it work? Otherwise, I will use a mic like this. It's better. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think it works. Thank you so much. So, turning myself now to you. So, could you please, maybe we'll start with you, Professor Mbaye, show us the word you chose, and could you please explain us why?
Here is the word I chose. Here is the word I picked: climate change. And when I looked at the outcome of the poll, I'm very reassured that that is the right challenge, because climate change, from an African perspective, is cross-cutting all the challenges which appeared on the board. Climate change is bringing about conflict. We estimate that. Yeah, it is estimated that a 1 degree increase in temperature will bring about an increase of conflict by 4.5%. So the connection between climate change and conflicts is well established. So is the correlation between climate change and migration, between climate change and food security, between climate change and geopolitical crisis, between climate change and trade. So to me, it's a very important dimension of polycrisis.
Thank you so much, Professor Mbaye. Professor Musemwa, could you, I give you my mic?
Okay, thank you very much. So, like my colleague here, I've also chosen, at some point I felt like as though I was copying him because he wrote the word first and finished before me. but nevertheless, it just demonstrates that this is the biggest challenge the world is facing. So climate change comes to mind because it is actually, perhaps even before the word polycrisis was being used, I was already thinking of climate change as almost equal to the word polycrisis, because climate change, it kind of encapsulates all the major challenges that we are being confronted with as we speak. Like my colleague said, migration, displacement, water scarcity, which of course is my area of study, droughts, floods that we have never experienced, especially in the part of the world I come from, Southern Africa. Some of these problems were unheard of. We have got winds that just nobody understands. They are accompanied by major floods, but at the same time, you also have this part of the region, Southern Africa, being afflicted by massive droughts leading to hunger, massive droughts leading to conflict. And also, we shouldn't forget that part and parcel of the effects of climate change are also systemic problems around governance, around undemocratic regimes, authoritarian governments, stolen elections, all that. So in many ways, climate change could actually pass for just one word that defines the challenges that the world is facing. But as a historian, I am not usually convinced that this is merely a contemporary problem. Yes, it is. We have come to realize it as a new problem, but thanks to communication systems, technological systems that have, changed people's lives, because we quickly share this information. So it's not as if these problems were not actually happening before. One has to look at the historical genesis or the historical roots of these problems, and some of them date as far back as the 19th century, and they've only been incremental as time goes on. So let me stop here and now.
Thank you so much, Professor Musemwa. Professor Zagel, could you show us your choice?
Thank you very much. Actually, I chose two words. The first one is chaos. Yeah, we have so many crises. You mentioned the climate crisis. We have an economic crisis. We have a food crisis. We have a migration crisis. We have a governance crisis. All of these crises are interlinked and reinforce each other. But I have a second, more hopeful word, which is polysolutions. It will not be easy to tackle this new dimension, this polycrisis. But what we need are really solutions from every different angle. Yeah. So we need a whole toolbox of solutions. Legal regulation is a good thing. Yeah, but it needs to be implemented. We have to think of the historic dimensions. How was this tackled in the past? How does it function now? We can look at the question, how do solutions work on the African continent? May this be feasible for us, and the other way around? Yeah, we have to look at economic feasibility of solutions, and we need communication and education. If we have the best solutions and the population doesn't understand and support these solutions in the climate change context especially, but also in other contexts, it won't work. The other dimension of this polysolution is that we need methods to ensure that the measures taken to address one crisis do not affect other crises. Yeah? And this is something which is essential. For instance, in the field of COVID and climate change. COVID, we were asked to open the windows not to be infected. Climate change requires us to close the windows, to keep heat and cold inside, or cold inside the building, depending on where we live. Yeah, so we have one solution which has entirely different effects on different crises. So one of these methods is, of course, law. So here we always need to balance different interests, and laws usually have, also legal rules usually have exceptions to address other interests, but also all our other scientific branches, I say, do have such methods. If we have the economic branch, you always have to consider different interests. If you have sociology and so on. So very important will be to approach this in an interdisciplinary manner with a huge toolbox. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Zagel. Professor Mbaye, what's your word? Could you, or words? I don't know if you choose.
Thank you very much. I chose catastrophe and vulnerability.
Okay.
As my colleagues have submitted, polycrisis has to do with the interlinkage of many problems that affect the world, whether in the global south or in the global north, and at times, basically, there is a clear linkage. With the COVID-19, definitely, all of us were sort of negatively affected by this, and some societies it went into something to do with the being so vulnerable, because when COVID came, then it also was linked with the food scarcity because of lack of movements and all that. And when you think about what my colleagues have submitted in terms of climate change, then the issue of vulnerability becomes so clear. The issue of catastrophe, because catastrophe is associated with the extreme aspects that can even cause loss of life. In Uganda, for example, we have seen many people in the Karamoja region dying because of hunger, lack of food, and all that. Very extreme drought conditions, leading to world concern, catastrophe, vulnerability, poverty issues. And so, in my opinion, polycrisis can be a result of very many negative circumstances, geopolitical tensions, diseases, pandemics, but all of that leading to catastrophic issues, leading to a lot of vulnerability. Even people that can be living on the knife edge, for example, can fall into back to poverty. Allow me one thing is, for example, because many farmers in developing countries depending on the gifts of nature, they depend on the availability of the rainfall with a good mix of sunshine so as to grow crops. In Uganda, for example, we expected rain 2 months ago, and many farmers in anticipation grew their crops, so knowing that by August, rain will be at the peak. But I want to tell you, until the time I left the country, many sunshine was everywhere, very extreme. And that means that those that put their crops in the soil will have lost it, but they don't have money actually to buy other seeds to catch up, because we are told rains are going to intensify around now, but we have lost them for 2 months, which is a clear effect of climate change, leading to poverty and vulnerability, and of course, hunger and death. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Bbaale. Thank you, to the four of you for these very insightful first impressions. So now I propose you to, well, dive a bit deeper into the complexity of polycrisis. And to start us off, I would like to pose a common question to all our panelists. At various moments in history, from the plague in the 14th century to World War II, humankind has, of course, faced interconnected complex crises, and these have affected multiple continents. So are we facing a comparable threat today? And what makes these current polycrises different from the former polycrisis? In other words, what's new? Professor Musemwa, you already, well, say a few brief words about these, but I would like, well, to come back on this question. I don't know if you would like to develop a bit more what you said at first, or if you would like me to give the floor and then you will react. But as an historian, I think it would be good if you could start.
So yes, what's new about this polycrisis? I mean, just to imagine, I mean, and you go back as far, as far back as the 14th century. I mean, to look at, diseases that have really, the Black Death, for example, the Spanish influenza of 1918, and most recently the COVID-19, and a lot of scholars started analyzing the effects of that disease, and to begin to look back at how societies had withstood, previous pandemics. And so, I mean, as a historian, I think it behooves every historian to really make the necessary connections between a contemporary problem, and that is to simply say that there's no way, we can, attend to what we think is a current problem without actually tracing the roots of that problem. It is almost as if one decides to forget their history, and then they continue to make the same mistakes that their forefathers, their ancestors, used to make repeatedly. And society cannot advance on the basis of an absence of the recognition of the importance of history. Now, back to the question, polycrisis, what is new? I think what is new is the fact that, and I did refer to the way we communicate nowadays is very, very different from the way our forefathers used to communicate. If you wanted to send a message, someone would have to run some 10,000 kilometers to deliver a message from the king to their subjects. We don't do that anymore. In a matter of seconds, I don't know, like milliseconds, a message can be transmitted across the world. When COVID happened, it was very easy for us to communicate. And quarantined as we were in our houses. I mean, and I consider that term quarantine to have really been everyone's experience. We only think of quarantine for those who were affected by COVID, but I think all of us as societies in our respective areas were, in fact, quarantined. But we managed to continue to communicate thanks to various forms of communication, social media, and all that. So the contemporary nature of the problems we face, the fact that we see a confluence of these challenges coming almost at the same time, I think for me it's a mere coincidence. But the real fact behind them is that these problems have been developing over time. They've just come to a point of maturation where when each time we look around, we see that these problems are really beginning to affect everyone. By the way, these crises, in their multiple and multi-dimension ways, are, I think each time we are attending to them, we really need to understand to break them apart, so that we don't continue to see them as one monolithic challenge, but I think to trace each one of them, each crisis, and how intersecting they are at the level of analysis. I think that's going to be very, very important. The problem I have with the term polycrisis, much as it is a wonderful new descriptor of the challenges we confront, the problem is that I'm not so sure that it has any analytical power, any analytical value. Perhaps that's to come at some point, but I have serious problems with it, because it's not helping us to really analyze what is at stake. But what it simply does is it helps us to really bring these challenges together. The danger of having terms such as polycrisis and celebrating them too much, they become something of an omnibus term, a term that embraces all and sundry. But really, when you say, how do you theorize this, it doesn't help you to do that. So we almost always have to fall back on our disciplines to begin to analyze these things. Myself, and this is my last point, as an environmental historian, the genius of environmental history for me has been its ability to use different types of methods of analysis, sources of information, and you amalgamate them together. We've always understood, for me as a historian of water, that the manner in which water permeates all disciplines, the way in which water, if you want to think of it as a metaphor, the way it permeates boundaries. It can cross landscapes, it can seep underground, and it knows no boundary. Disease knows no boundary. We know that. And so I think this is what I mean by actually beginning to break down what this polycrisis is. Yes, it's wonderful to have this polycrisis as a recognition of the confluence of these challenges. But I think we really need, as scholars, we will be doing humanity and our students a great service if we really give them the tools of how to analyze these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very insightful answer. Professor Mbaye, please, what's new?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very challenging question. A quick analysis of what is happening right now and what was happening, for example, in the 70s, might bring us to believe that history is repeating itself. But to me, this quick analysis is misleading. Remember, in the 70s, what happened? We had global environmental challenges with drought in many countries. Right now, we're having a climate crisis. We had an energy crisis in the 70s. Right now, we're having an energy crisis. We had a governance crisis then, with students rioting almost all over the world. And we have the same right now. We have a Cold War with the divide between the West and the East, and we have a Cold War happening right now. So we have a lot of similarities. But to me, the magnitude of the conundrum we are facing right now is just unique. The environmental crisis then was limited to drought. But right now, climate change has much bigger effect than drought. Climate change is about extreme events. You can have drought, you can have flooding. And we economists, we sometimes talk about the paradox of plenty. When you don't have enough water, it's a problem. But when you have too much water, it's a problem. And you have both. So climate change is by no means comparable to what we used to have in the 70s. But right now, we have also a distrust in science. Then people used to believe in science. Now the distrust in science is on the rise almost everywhere in the world, in particular in the global north. That's a very big problem. But even more worrisome is that we have a distrust in our democracy, in the system. We have a systemic distrust. Democracy is being challenged almost everywhere in the world. We didn't have that in the 70s. We have a geopolitics, a global geopolitics, which is very different than when we had in the 70s. In the 70s, we had two big poles, the West and the East. But now we have many different poles. You have Europe, you have the US, you have Asia, you have many, multipolarity in the world geopolitics. And we have the revolution in IT. And the consequence is that governments can be challenged in a much easier way because people can coordinate using IT technology to become more effective in doing writing or things like that. So yes, history tends to repeat itself, but to me, the magnitude of the crisis is deeper, and the need to coordinate policies at global level is much more urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this extremely interesting answer. Professor Zagel, please.
Thank you very much. So the question is polycrisis different from other crises? And as we heard before, I'm not very sure yet whether this type helps us or has any additional value to our real problem, which is how to address crises. Yeah, we have many crises. We have the climate crisis, food crisis, and so on. We have mentioned this. And apparently the instruments we have and use are not sufficient. Yeah, when I think of the climate crisis, the UNFCCC, so the UN regime, was adopted 30 years ago when I was a student, and it's still not working. Yeah, or not sufficiently working, the international cooperation. Yeah, so apparently we do have a problem with legal instruments and with addressing these issues. From a legal point of view, so law in general is a good instrument to address crises. Usually when you adopt a law or also an international convention, you always do that because you have a problem. And you adopt some rules of general application to prevent that the problem becomes a crisis. Yeah? If you look at your national parliaments, you see how much discussion and how many different interests have to be considered before you really make it a law. And this is the reason why treaties take sometimes decades to enter into force. This is why laws take decades sometimes to enter into force, and we see that when we look at our national climate law and policy. So what I think we need, and what may be even more needed to address the polycrisis with adequate solutions, is interdisciplinary work. And I think most of our disciplines, we mostly work within our fields. Yeah, if I, as an international lawyer, work with a constitutional lawyer, I think this is interdisciplinary. Yeah, but this is definitely not how we are going to solve the problems of the polycrisis. So I think what we really need is more interdisciplinarity, looking at the methods of other disciplines to develop sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Professor Mbaye, please.
Thank you very much. For me, I would start from, I would condemn the history, that what has happened historically is what is really causing what we are going through in terms of the crisis, the vulnerability, and the catastrophes that we see. during my time as a young person, our parents used to forecast very well, and you know that in the first week of March, we are having the rains of our first growing season, and it was definite. Okay, and even if you planted your crops, for example, 3 days before the rain, for sure the rain would come. But today, you find that the forecasts that we do, not using machines, but using the ingenuity and the historical information that we have been having as human beings, is no longer correct. You forecast that the first growing season in Uganda is the first week of March. The second growing season is the first week of August. Those ones are no longer really correct. And so climate change has caused all of this. But now climate change is a result of historical human activity that actually led to emissions of carbon and all that. And so that's why I'm trying to say that rather than actually comparing the crisis historically and the crisis currently, I would say that actually our human activities historically are responsible for the enhanced polycrisis that we are seeing today in our countries, in our continents, and globally. And actually, this has even caused changes in the patterns of diseases. There are some areas in Uganda where we used not to have malaria, for example. Mm-hmm. The Bbaale region in the western Uganda, there isn't not to be malaria at all because the mosquitoes wouldn't survive in those conditions. But now you find very many malaria cases, which shows that actually climate change has caused conditions to change, and so malaria comes in. But when you think about also the food security aspects, again, we used to be very, very food secure before, but now we are very much food insecure. And now this one is combined with a lot of migration. For example, Uganda is home to very many migrants that have, because of the regional conflicts and all that, people have come in from different countries, but now they are coming to a country where, you know, it is no longer very, very clear on whether we shall have, for example, we shall harvest enough food after this season that I'm talking about. So you find that the historical aspects are also impacting on, increasing the effect of migration, the effect of migration on the population. And when this one is combined even with the wars and the geopolitical tensions and all that, it becomes what I would call enhanced polycrisis, because you have seen what is happening from history, having the environmental challenges and climate change, but when these other things just come, they find a very weak, non-resilient society, which quickly breaks down. But also allow me to talk about it from the positive angle, that now, these days, because of research and research, basically, in universities, we are better able to respond to some of these things. If you take an example of COVID-19, Makerere University did great in trying to help the community respond in a particular way, providing solutions, advising government, providing testing kits and all that. So the technological advancement, the advancement in education, the advancement in research and training can help us better respond. But also, when you think about the earlier days and now, now there is research going on improved crop varieties that can be drought resistant, that can be resistant to pests and diseases and all that, which means that the advancement in knowledge, technology through education and training can help us actually survive somewhat these crises. But in addition to the global collaboration, the global collaboration, which I think is stronger today than it were before. And so where we can draw our safety nets and where we can draw our resilience from each other. For example, now that we are into this polycrisis project, coming up with the new knowledge, coming up with the training programs, how to address polycrisis in our countries, in our continent, but also globally, is something new that we have not been having before. There is a hope for more resilient communities, societies, and continents because of the collaboration that we see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will come back to this, potential solutions later on. So let's now turn to a round of questions related to interconnected global risks and the economy. And let me first turn to Professor Zagel. You know that the World Economic Forum has highlighted the compounding effects of interconnected global risks in creating polycrisis. So in this context, I have two questions. How do you foresee the legal challenges of international trade evolving as we face the prospect of more frequent and severe global shocks? That's the first question. And do you think polycrisis events might amplify the tensions between trade on the one hand and human rights on the other?
Thank you very much. So this is a very complex question. When we look at international trade and investment, I guess these are instruments to enhance economic development in all our countries. Yeah. So, and this is an essential element of tackling any kind of crisis. Yeah, if we do need climate mitigation and climate adaptation measures, we need a lot of money to do that in Europe as well as in Africa. So enhancing international trade and investment through trade agreements between the EU and Africa, let's say, is in principle a good thing. However, these trade agreements may also have a lot of adverse effect, which actually impede that economic development. If we look we also see, at least in Europe, a lot of protests of the population against these kind of instruments. So if, let's say, if we say we import cheap agricultural products to African countries to save or to help save the food crisis there, this of course also means that the agricultural industry, I may call it, in African countries is affected. The same happens the other way around. If we say in African countries you have the possibility to produce reasonably clothes, or several articles, this will destroy our industry. So it will put the sewing business, the people, the workers on the streets, and this also affects our workers and our welfare. Another problem, you talked about trade and human rights. International trade law requires not to discriminate. So for instance, it's not possible to stop the import of products which are produced by child labor or which are produced under conditions which adversely affect the social standards of workers. Yeah, this is kind of a complex situation. And it may make sense that you are not allowed to do these differentiations from an economic point of view. But this is, of course, problematic and adversely affects crises in the partner countries. Yeah, the same for climate change. You are not allowed to stop products because they are produced in a manner which affects the climate, for instance. Yeah. So these trade instruments are, so international trade is a good thing to enhance economic development, but it may affect other crises or enhance other crises. So far, I do not think that we have adequate solutions. The EU has developed a lot of attempts, first of all, not addressing sustainable development issues at all. From now, monitoring them, this is not necessary. It is an adequate instrument, and probably also an instrument which is kind of a neo-colonial instrument, I'd say, because are we supposed to tell our partners how to address these issues? Yeah, so it's a problematic point and currently not helping to address the polycrisis, I say.
Thanks a lot, Gudrun. Building on this, Professor Mbaye, from your perspective as an academic, an African academic specialized in development economics, how does the specific nature of African markets, and especially including the role of the informal sector, interact with the global dynamics of polycrisis? And does this informal economy increase the vulnerability of communities to global shocks, or on the contrary, does it protect the vulnerable groups from their impact? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the crisis we observe in international trade is a very significant manifestation of polycrisis. Remember, during the 20 years following the World War II, we experienced a meteoric rise in international trade. International trade had increased by 300% in the 20 years following World War II, while global output increased by half. So trade was increasing faster than output. And we had a lot of factors explaining that. The revolution we were experiencing in the area of transportation and logistics, in the area of IT, but also in the legal framework. My colleague just mentioned that. We put in place what we called GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and afterwards WTO. And also the system of payment was much easier and much more reliable, as everyone was using the dollar for international trade. And all this has brought about a very long period of peace and stability worldwide. I think it's well known, it's common sense. When people are busy doing business, they're not busy fighting each other. But what is worrisome right now is that the engine seems to be working the other way around. We have a transportation crisis. If you look at what is happening in the Black Sea, in the Middle East, we have the dollar, which is being increasingly challenged as a single means of payment for international trade. We have protectionism, which is on the rise, etc., etc. And of course, this is making life very complicated for everyone, but especially for Africa, because African countries are much more fragile than countries in other regions of the world. But international trade, as has been said, is not the only manifestation of polycrisis. We have geopolitics. We have the crisis of multilateralism. Coordination of policy has become much more complicated now than before. People could reach agreement on trade, on climate or things like that, much easier before than now. And we have a migration crisis going on, and we have a security crisis, and we have a global public health crisis. Now, how is the world dealing with all these crises, and how this is playing out in Africa? I have to say that the world is dealing with this crisis in a very selfish way. I'll just give you one example, two examples, responding more directly to your question. What did you observe during the pandemics? Some developed countries just were keeping a quantity of doses of vaccines 10 times beyond what they needed. At the same time, we didn't have one single dose in Africa. I remember in my country, the people who eventually got vaccinated, the proportion was as low as sometimes 5%. At the time, we had doses which were kept somewhere. So this tells a lot about how global crises are being dealt with. Another example is climate crisis. Everybody knows that Africa is contributing a very tiny share of global emission. The contribution from Africa is less than 3%. On the contrary, Africa is one of the climate hotspots according to IPCC, meaning that temperature is rising faster in Africa than elsewhere. And the damage to livelihoods is much bigger in Africa than elsewhere. You remember at the beginning, countries from the global north, they committed to set up a fund to support adaptation, meaning to help African countries deal with the effect of climate change. And they committed 100 billion of US dollar per annum. And so far, they have only funded adaptation to the amount of 4.4 billion. It's nothing. And if you look at the loss and damage fund, which was set up during the last COP28 summit, the fund is only 700 million of US dollar. The gap is too big, from 700 million cumulative over time to 100 billion per annum. So this is a very, very, very big challenge. And related to that, how the global north is dealing with the migration crisis. They are building physical walls or artificial walls, hoping they will isolate them from being invaded by migrants. I think this is a nonsense to me. The best way to deal with migration is to support origin countries to hold their use on the spot. And to me, the very nature of policies need to change. When governments are designing policies, to me, they should look at the impact of the policies inside their national borders, but they should also be mindful about the impact of these policies outside their borders, because of what might be a boomerang effect. What you are doing here in Europe has implications in Africa, and this implication reverberates back to Europe. I think the world needs much more coordination to deal with all these challenges we are talking about and related to multi-crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your answer. Professor Mbaye, would you like to react to this as an economist? Would you like to react to the answers of both colleagues in the panel. And also I have another question for you, because you referred to the management by Makerere University of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. And so I had also a question for you about, well, some advices, if you can, on how to address these crises, such crisis in a more inclusive manner. So that's a way to, well, move slowly to the next round of questions related to, well, social impact and inequalities.
Thank you very much. And I got intrigued by the response on international trade and investment. How are these evolving amidst? But I want to say that investment and international trade, okay, investment, for example, is critical if we are to move away. I mean, to be more resilient, and also to be more focused on sustainable development. We need a lot of money to invest. And if you think about the green transitions, and which actually involve a bigger part, which is the actually energy transitions. When I move around the streets of Salzburg, but also other cities in the developed world, and compare with the cities in Africa, then it is there's a very, very big difference. And it shows that many African countries are not yet ready for this transition, for example. When you move around, for example, there are cycle lanes around here, there are pedestrian lanes and all that, but also you see that there is a great stride towards e-mobility, for example, the electric vehicles and all that, trying to make sure that the emissions actually reduce. I'm going back to the investment issue. Developing countries actually require a lot of money to actually start moving the journey towards green transitions, energy transitions. If you think about my own city in Kampala, if you are to make sure that there are cycle lanes in the city center, but also there are clear pedestrian lanes, that requires an overhaul of the entire infrastructure setup of the country, which actually I'm very sure that the country alone does not have enough resources to overhaul the infrastructure that is currently available. Even when you think about having collective means of transport to make sure that people move in groups rather than in driving cars and all that, it again goes to the infrastructure overhaul, etc. So the root causes of the polycrisis can only be dealt with through huge investments, especially on the African continent. And there is a big question on where would climate financing or financing resilience or financing adaptation come from. And so the issue of investment is more, is a bigger question, more in the developed world. And we really need to have, again, collaborative efforts to make sure that we overcome that. And when you think about our basket of goods that we export, many developing countries, we export primary products that are not processed, are not manufactured. And in many of the cases, for example, my country is more agricultural products than manufactured products. And so when you think about it in terms of the changes in the environment and all that, it means that our basket of goods is affected already through climate change and all that, which actually creates this terms of trade imbalance between the developed but also the underdeveloped countries. But very importantly, when you think about the non-tariff barriers to trade, now EU has already started thinking about how are you producing this product? Are you producing it with a lot of carbon emissions or not? And if you do, so there is gonna be certification, and this doesn't matter whether actually Uganda is industrialized tomorrow. So the question is, what's the source of energy that you are using to produce your industrial products? What's the source of energy that you are using to produce your agricultural products? And therefore, are you able now? Are you able to access the global markets? Are you able to do that? And so it is already very clear that the climate change and the need to mitigate climate change effects has resulted into a new trade order, a new way of looking at international trade. The restriction, there are now new non-tariff restrictions to trade, and it is clearly connected to climate change. And the developing countries are likely to suffer a lot. And there is also a bigger question to the economy. For example, whether actually the clean energy can help non-industrialized countries to industrialize. When you think about the energy that is used or was used in China, in the United States, but also in the EU 27 before, then you realize that actually a lot of coal and others were used. Even developing countries are using that. But now the coal, not the coal, the energy, but now the global coal, for us to transit into cleaner energy, also comes in with a question of whether the cleaner sources of energy are strong enough to spur industrialization. Because in the 1880s or Industrial Revolution, a lot of unclean energy was used, and maybe it was the what pushed industrialization to go on. And so in the economic sense of international trade, production, and others, I can see that climate change, which is basically a world crisis, is creating a new way. We are going to think about international trade. New trade restrictions are coming on. Products that are, that depend on nature will fail to come, but also products that are produced in another way may not come forth. I think that's what I can
thank you very much. So keep your answer on my second question for later. Okay. So Professor Musemwa, so let's turn now to you about social impact and inequalities. So your research on water related conflicts shows how environmental challenges and social justice intersect. So based on this, how can the principles of environmental justice be applied to address the social impacts arising from polycrisis? What strategies or policies can be implemented to ensure a more equitable distribution of resources and access to essential services?
Thank you very much.
And please feel free, of course, to react to what was said before if you wish so.
All right, thank you so much. I mean, this is obviously a very complex question. So as my colleagues were speaking when they were talking about, investment, I kept thinking that yes, investment is very, very important. Every country needs some sort of investment from within and from outside. But for me, the question is, what good is investment if it is not, if the proceeds and profits of that investment are not going to be directed towards alleviating the needs of the poor, towards alleviating or even eliminating the inequalities within a particular society. Quite often, the proceeds of investment, as we see in a number of countries, it need not just be Africa, but you see this across the world, where we've got, very greedy leaders, politicians, and they become the beneficiaries of trade. They become the beneficiaries of of profit, but very little is actually plowed back into developing societies. I mean, my colleague there is talking about Kampala, how he's going to take a whole, I don't know, billions, I think, of dollars to actually restructure. That's not likely to happen, whether in Zimbabwe, whether in South Africa. It's highly unlikely to happen because of the misallocation of budgets. I can't tell you how many times in a country such as South Africa, where we know, dating from the days of apartheid, and now post 1994, when South Africa gained, the new democratic dispensation, that almost every year, funds allocated for local government or municipal development, about half the budget is sent back to Treasury. Yet you have got a crisis in service delivery. What does that tell us? It's not that the money is not there. It's just the sheer misallocation or just the lack of knowledge on how to actually use that money to develop local communities. And what you do find quite often is that word, the C word, corruption, is what is actually killing a lot of these economies. So all I'm saying to you is, it's not lack of resources. Yes, in some countries it's lack of resources, but you only need to scrutinize the budgets. Allocation is fundamental, but when it comes to the actual spending of that money, where is it going to? It's going into individuals' pockets, and the justice system is also not helping. Yes, South Africa is often lauded as having one of the most robust justice systems, but of course, justices don't go on the street to arrest, perpetrators. It's the police that does that. If you've got a corrupt police, then you're not likely to bring anyone to book. Yet we see newspapers, headlines in newspapers or social media are talking about the sheer depth of corruption that is taking place. So it's not going to be an overnight affair to say we have really brought everyone on par. We are eliminating this these inequalities. They go deeper, and and they go deeper. They are historical, and only a resilient governance system is going to help us to actually eliminate this. So it comes with you talk of environmental injustice. We can also talk about social injustice. There's so many injustices that will have to be addressed in order to eliminate this.
Thank you very, very much for this answer. Now, last question, well, shifting the narrative from pessimism surrounding polycrisis, sorry, not PolyCIVIS, of course. So from pessimism to, I would say, positive narrative. We already mentioned several times the importance, of course, of resilience. So, who would like to speak first about this? So, what solutions? So, how to build such resilience? What to do to get to a positive narrative in front of polycrisis? And I would like to ask you to be extremely brief. I'm sorry, but we are already a bit too late. So in, well, I would say 1 minute. So a list of solutions or some solutions at least you see. Yes.
Want to start with
Yes.
me? Okay. As we were, speaking, and I kept thinking about this very question that I don't think we need to be too pessimistic, to use your word. I think we waste a great deal of time mourning over problems that we see are continuing to afflict us. But it is what, I think what we do about them is what is going to be of critical importance. So I would say that vigilance is what is needed. Dating back to, let's just go as little back as, say, the 1960s. Let's go back as far as the post-Second World War.
Okay.
That's when you saw the great acceleration taking place, isn't it? And a lot was done in the name of progress. And little did we know that we were going to pay for some of the consequences of that progress. And we are paying heavily for that. There was little vigilance on that which was called economic development. And with economic development came the destruction of forests, the destruction of grasslands, you name it, the alteration of landscapes and so on and so forth. We celebrated that in the name of progress. Until about the 1960s, when that big wave of environmentalism swept across not just the United States, but across many continents, as people really awakened to the damage that was being done. And so without that kind of vigilance, then I think we are not going anywhere. We will continue to be afflicted by developments that we celebrate as progress, yet they're actually gonna lead at some point to regression in terms of our lives. And that will be manifested through several diseases, deaths that are unexplained, inexplicable, and so on and so forth. So I don't mean to end on a pessimistic note, but I'm simply saying that we need to be vigilant as we go forward.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Let me start by emphasizing a very disastrous effect of polycrisis in Africa. It was a previous question. I'm very briefly coming back to that. This effect is rising inequalities within countries and across countries. And African countries are shouldering a very disproportionate burden of polycrisis. When you have climate change again, vulnerable people in Africa are suffering. When you have economic crisis, they're suffering. And this brings about riots. For example, when prices are increasing, the informal sector is hardly hurt, and people whose livelihoods are based on informal activities, they're just resisting. According to the ACLED data, the number of riots in the Sahel, the region where I come from, has increased 75-fold in less than 10 years. So that is a very big challenge. So now, turning to the positive note, I think the humanities had the right leverage to deal with polycrisis. Technology is fueling right now polycrisis. We need to turn it to address polycrisis. But for that, we need coordination. We need to see the world as a global village, and we coordinate policies in order to address the inequality issue, which is a very big issue everywhere, in Europe, in the US, but even more so in Africa, but also to address related challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I chose poly solutions as my topic. So what I think is we need to strengthen interdisciplinary cooperation to cope with one crisis and several crises. But I think there is one point we should consider, and this is the young generation. Yeah, when I talk to young people, many of them are kind of desperate. They have the impression, and this is true, that our generation, caused this mess and we don't have any solutions. And what I think, I mean, the youth is our future. We need to communicate with the young generation, with our students, which we have at hand in the universities. We need to listen to their needs, and we need a confident young generation to secure our future, basically. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that I'll start from the point that Professor Mbaye made about the global and local partnerships, where governments, civil society, private sector are all brought on board to work together so that nobody is left behind if we are to address these issues. But also there should be cross-sector collaboration, because the crises come from different, is multifaceted, and therefore working in silos shouldn't happen. Health, environment, education, and all that, cross-sector collaboration. But also equity and justice must be at the forefront, because there should be inclusive policies that target the most vulnerable into this. Then also there's need to prioritize the community-led solutions, local knowledge and leadership. There might be grassroots movements that need to be supported. But second last for me is the systematic change and sustainability. This has to do with the transitions, the green transition, the energy transitions that actually target to be, societies, countries, continents to be more resilient to climate change. The movement away from the dirty sources of energy to more cleaner sources of energy is looked at as a very, very sustainable solution to reducing emissions and all that. But something not to forget, when I come to what Gudrun has submitted, the role of education, research, and innovation. The role of education, research, and innovation, because that's why we are here in a meeting where we want to look at polycrisis. Personally, I am contributing in the teaching module where we want to develop a short course trying to build capacity of our young people. How do you manage polycrisis? What can be the solutions and all that? And beyond that, then deeper research and innovation into solutions that can help us go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all those solutions with vigilance, technological opportunities, collaborations, polysolution, interdisciplinary cooperation, communication with confidence in young people, inclusive policy, not working in silos, developing research, innovation, and education for all. So great. Thank you so much for this very positive note. So now I will turn myself to the audience and to the questions we receive. So we have, well, some delay, but I've been told that we can continue until 22:11, if that's okay for, yes, 22. Great. So 15 minutes, a bit less for questions from the audience. And we received one online, which I would like to read, by Dr. Anthony Tiba-Iangana from Makerere University. And I will read it out loud. Although polycrisis seems to be related to people and society generally, I wish to know whether there are studies that have analyzed the impact of polycrisis on academia, both in Europe and Africa. Is it not the time for us to be a bit selfish, to see how we are, as academics, specifically affected by polycrisis? Who would like to react to this? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very important question. Polycrisis is affecting academia in a certain number of ways. The first impact is, again, what I said earlier, a rising distrust in science and the rise of populism, which is a consequence of this distrust in science. Even in Western countries, many polls show that people believe less in science now than before. So this is a very, very important development in academia. Now, in African settings, we have another adverse development. Our universities are very highly unionized and politicized. So instability within universities is also growing with polycrisis. It's almost impossible to have a revolution taking place in a country, in Africa, without a very deep and serious involvement of the educated youth, I mean the student. So this is a very adverse development and consequence of polycrisis in Africa, in the region I come from.
Thank you. Would you like also to react?
Yeah, just a little bit. Again, I totally agree. It's a very important question. But one also has to think that, or rather appreciate that academia is made of scholars. They are human beings. They are human beings who live in communities. They interact with the communities that they do research on. So they cannot experience it completely isolated, or rather have a completely isolated experience of the effects of the polycrisis. What seems to really elevate scholars in academia is the ability to, take a step back and begin to look at these problems and try to explain what they mean for the benefit of society. And so, yes, we are confronted as universities. If you think of academia in broad terms, our students, administrators, those who offer services, and so on and so forth. And I think all of us are bearing the brunt of that polycrisis. If you consider universities to be microcosmic of society, that the student population, the academics, the administrators, all represent different facets of society. Then, of course, yes, we get to feel the effects of the polycrisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I think it affects us in the way on how to develop solutions. And I mentioned what we need is interdisciplinarity. So more than before to solve the crisis or the crises. And the problem is that interdisciplinarity is a challenge for all of us. We are all speaking different languages. If I have a law language, you have a history language, you have an economics languages, and when I explain a problem in my legal language, most of you will not understand this. But only if we understand each other, we can develop common solutions. So I think one of the challenges for us as academics is that we strengthen our interdisciplinarity capabilities. And thank you, Anthony. Greetings to Kampala.
I thought that since the question came from Kampala, that I would be exempted from giving my view, but I want to agree with my colleagues that definitely academia is affected, and I mean, when you take a step back and look at the polycrisis and all that, then there is a challenge that all of us as academia are faced, because we must be the source of solution. So in my own opinion, it is a double-edged sword in such a way that we are affected as members of the community. First of all, even mobility may be difficult. Okay. Yeah, we may not be able to move from one area to another, but at the same time, we are given a challenge. We are how can I make it? It is an opportunity. I didn't want to use the word opportunity for us to show, for us to be able to contribute to solving societal problems. It is an opportunity for us to dive into those problems and try to be a solution.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Are there questions here in the room? I will give the floor to the lady.
Thank you. I'm Lara Leik from Salzburg University. In the past, I held lots of lectures in front of students from different disciplines about climate change, climate activism, and solutions. And I was full of hope, but now with the political difficulties we have, like in Austria and Europe, I get more and more frustrated. Also because it's really hard to reduce the complexity of climate change and the polycrises that are caused by it, or caused by the standard of living we have in Europe. So, but also for me, it's really important that the students, like in school, but also in the university, understand, like when I talk about the solutions, like the poly solutions, why do I talk about we have to fight our structural racism we have in Europe? What does it have to do with climate change, like the topic of my lecture? So my question is, do you have any recommendations on how to reduce the complexity of this topic, but also to make it that clear that we have so many solutions and that it's not just don't emit too much CO2 or use other technologies, but also on a political, on a law level, on a structural level. Yeah.
Who would like to reply?
Let me hazard an answer. I totally agree with you. Is in the first time I responded, I did talk about what the word polycrisis does for us. That it actually represents an amalgamation of a whole host of crises. We're trying to bring them together so that at least we can try and confront them like that. But that actually makes the whole notion, whole phenomenon of polycrisis more complex. I then moved on to say that perhaps the best approach, if we really want to understand what the polycrisis is to take it in its various multiple dimensions, analyze each one of them, then perhaps at the end come back to make your generalizations that then speak to the word polycrisis. But to simply attach the word polycrisis to a whole complex web of crises is not going to really help us, and it's not going to help our students to understand. And so breaking down each topic, demonstrating the relationship between a particular crisis with structural racism, to take your example, for me is what is going to really help. So the whole is fine, but I think the various aspects considered as as individual elements is really going to help us.
Thank you very much. We will now take, because we have 4 minutes left, some questions from we received from participants online. Dan?
Thank you very much, Anne. And perhaps to do justice also to the different questions that were asked, allow me just to give you an idea of the range of questions we received, and then propose to focus on one at this stage. So we had questions related to corruption as a root problem also to be addressed. We had one related to how policymakers can accelerate the pace of action. One about whether all countries are equally affected by polycrisis. A question about fatigue with regards to crisis narratives that I think are the question from the room already also tackled to a certain extent. And then one that I would propose to perhaps focus on, which is about how to address the unequal power relations between global North and Africa in addressing the polycrisis, knowing that there is also a need really for two continents to come together in this regard. So I would love to suggest to the speakers focusing on this question to start. Thank you. Or rather to finish.
Thanks a lot to the online audience for their question, and for you, to you also, Dan. Who would like to pick up on the question identified by Dan?
Thank you very much. For me, I wouldn't really be of use to all those that have been mentioned. But if somebody thought about corruption, definitely corruption is a leakage of public resources through dishonest ways. And so it basically intensifies the issue of any crisis.
Mm-hmm.
If government allocated the resources to deal with COVID-19, and then a big percentage of that, or even if the small percentage is diverted, then you see that the efforts are really compromised. So I wouldn't go deeper than that. It is basically itself a driver of crisis. And then
and on the relation between Europe and Africa, maybe?
Yeah, countries equally affected. That's what I wanted to speak to. I would say no, because of the differences in the resilience, the preparedness. If you thought about the global North and the global South, yes, there is no boundaries to climate change effects. But how resilient are you? How prepared are you? In terms of infrastructure, in terms of many things. So the disproportionate effect of polycrisis across countries is emerging, not because these crises discriminate in impact, but it is because of how strong have you built your resilience system. How strong are you in terms of adaptability to these issues? Whether it is health related, how strong are you? Whether it is political related, how strong are your institutions and all that? Whether it is health related, how strong are your health systems? So that one creates a very big change in terms of a very big difference in terms of the effect.
Thank you so much.
Very briefly, I fully agree with my colleague. The capacity to build resilience in Europe is greater than in Africa to polycrisis. If you take the example of climate change, most African households are drawing their livelihoods from natural resources. So they are harder hit by climate change than European household on average. who have many other alternative options also to deal with climate change. So the capacity to deal with that is completely different. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So time flies, unfortunately. I would have loved continuing our discussion, but we need to stop here. The PolyCIVIS network will, of course, continue working on those very pressing issues. And this, of course, on an interdisciplinary basis, on a transcontinental basis, also Europe and African colleagues together. So we really invite you to follow our work and contribute, I would say, to our efforts. We have a website, so the PolyCIVIS website. So we invite you, of course, to follow this, and we will, of course, advertise the events, the other events we will organize. In closing, I would like to thank our 4 fantastic panelists. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments and answers. I would like also, of course, to thank our hosts, so Paris Lodron University and all the team here. It was greatly organized. I would like, of course, to thank the PolyCIVIS team. And of course, Dan Schreiber, many thanks, Sebastian Seifert, many thanks, and all the others as well, Constanza, many thanks. Olfa, I know she's there from Sfax University as well. A big thank to you all. And well, I really hope that we can continue working together and that we will be able to face polycrisis all together. Thank you so much.
Can I ask that we give a round of applause to our moderator for so effectively moderating this panel?
Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience, both in presence and online, and for the fantastic questions which were posed. Thank you, and have a nice coffee break.
This is the same project.